Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story, Invisible Man. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel and please share the videos. Thank you very much. Last words were certainly, sir. 1 minute more. I overlooked, and then Mr. Henry finished and went. But he went feeling excessively annoyed. Damn him, said Mr. Henry to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow. A man must do a clock at times, surely. And again, can't a man look at you ugly? And yet again, seemingly not. If the police was wanting you, you couldn't be more robbed and bandaged. At Gleason's corner he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and who now drove the Ipping conveyance, when occasional people required it, to Sidderbridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, to judge by his drive-in. "Oh, how do you do, Teddy?" he said, passing. "You got a rum on your home," said Teddy. Hall very sociably pulled up. "What's that?" he asked. "Rum-looking customer stopping at the Coach and Horses," said Teddy. "My sakes." And he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his grotesque guest. "Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place," said Henry. "But women are that trustful where strangers are concerned. He took your rooms, and he ain't even given a name, Hall." "You don't say so," said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension. "Yes," said Teddy, "by the week. Whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be stones in boxes, Hall." He told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteau. Altogether, he left Hall vaguely suspicious. "Get up, old girl," said Hall. "I suppose I must see about this." Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild injuries were answered snappily and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall in spite of these discouragements. "You women don't know everything," said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlour and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came next day. "You mind your own business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall, "and I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her, at the end of interminable necks and with vast black eyes. But being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. So, it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity into Ipin village. Next day, his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need, but in addition there were a box of books, big, fat books, of which some were just in an incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases, containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw, glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fernside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip preparatory to help him bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fernside's dog, who was sniffing in a delanted spirit at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps towards the tail of the cart, as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fernside's dog caught sight of him, however, than it began to bristle and growl savagely, and when he rushed down the steps it gave an undecided hop, and then sprang straight at his hand. "Whoop!" cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero with dogs. And Fernside howled, "Lie down," and snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand, heard a kick, saw the dog execute a flanking jump and get home on the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of his trousering. Then the finer end of Fernside's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke. Everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop to the latter, then turned and rushed swiftly up the steps into the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up the uncarpeted stairs to his bedroom. "You brute, you," said Fernside, climbing off the wagon with his whip in his hand, while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," said Fernside. "You better." Hall had stopped gaping. "He was bit," said Hall. "I'd better go and see to him," and he trotted after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the passage. "Carrie's drag," he said, "bit him." He went straight upstairs, and the stranger's door being ajar, he pushed it open and was entering without any ceremony, being of a natural sympathetic turn of blind. The blind was down and the room dim. He caught a glimpse of a most singular thing, what seemed a handless arm waving towards him, and a face of three huge, indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid that it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indescribable shapes, a blow and a concussion. There he stood on the dark little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple of minutes after, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside the coach and horses. There was Fernside telling about it all over again for the second time. There was Mrs. Hall saying his dog didn't have no business to bite her guest. There was Huckster the general dealer from over the road, interrogative, and Sandy Waggers from the forge, judicial, besides women and children, all of them saying fatuities. Wouldn't let 'em bite me, I knows. 'Twas right, have said dogs. What he bite for them, and so forth. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he had seen anything so very remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. "You don't want no help," he says. He said in answer to his wife's inquiry. "We'd better be a taking of his luggage in." "He ought to have it cauterized at once," said Mr. Huxter, "especially if it's at all inflamed." "I'd shoot 'em, that's what I'd do," said a lady in the group. Suddenly the dog began growling again. "Come along," cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the muffled stranger, with his collar turned up and his hat brim bent down. "The sooner you get those things in the better, I'll be pleased. It is stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves had been changed." "Was you hurt, sir?" said Fernside. "I'm rare sorry about the dog." "Not a bit," said the stranger. "Never broke the skin. Hurry up with those things." He then swore to himself, so Mr. Hall asserts. Directly the first cart was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlour, the stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Mrs. Hall's carpet. And from it he began to produce bottles, little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing coloured and white fluids, fluted blue bottles labelled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooded caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles, until all 6 were empty and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates beside the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner in to him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottles into test tubes, that he did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray on the table, with some little emphasis perhaps, seeing the state that the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. But she saw he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again, and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain of the straw on the floor when he anticipated her. "I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking," he said in the tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. "I knocked, but seemingly—perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you. Certainly, sir, certainly, sir. You can turn the lock, if you're like that, any time. A very good idea, said the stranger. This through, sir, if I might make so bold as to remark. Don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bill. And he mumbled at her, words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd, standing there, so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman, in which case I should like to know, sir, what you consider a shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling's enough. So be it, said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. If you're satisfied, of course. He turned and sat down with his coat collar towards her. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked, and, as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence. But once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to knock. I can't go on, he was raving. I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000. The huge multitude, cheated. All my life it may take me. Patience, patience. Indeed. Fool, fool. There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest of this soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the feigned crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it. Put it down in the bill, snapped her visitor. For God's sake, don't worry me. If there's a damage done, put it down in the bill. And he went on, ticking a list in the exercise book before him. I'll tell you something, said Fernside, mysteriously. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in the little bare shop of Ipin Hanger. Well, said Tenny Henfrey. This chap you're speaking of, what my dog bit. Well, he's black. Leastways his legs are. I see through the tear of his trousers and the tear of his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pinky to show, wouldn't you? Well, there wasn't none. Just blackness. I tell you, he's as black as my hat. My sakes, said Henry. It's a rummy case altogether. Why, his nose is as pink as paint. Well, that's true, said Fernside. I knows that. And I tell 'em what I'm thinking. That man's a piebald, Teddy. Black here and white there in patches. And he's ashamed of it. He's a kind of half-breed. And the colours come off patchy instead of mixing. I've heard of such things before, and it's the common way with horses, as any one can see. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Ipin with a certain fullness of detail, in order that the curious impression he created may be understood by the reader. But, excepting two odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over very curiously. There were a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared, he talked of the advisability of getting rid of him, but he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. "Wait till the summer," said Mrs. Hall sagely, "when the Arctics are beginning to come. Then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but bills seem punctual with bills being punctual, whatever you like to say." The stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious day, even in costume. He worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very fitfully. Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy. On others he would rise late, pace his room, fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part his manner was that of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him. But though Mrs. Hall listened conscientiously, she could make neither head nor tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out, muffled up invincibly, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose the loneliest parts and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two home-going labourers. And Teddy Henfrey, tumbling out of the scarlet coat one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head. He was walking hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the open inn-door. Such children as saw him at nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse. But there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a period of so remarkable an appearance as bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Ipin. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained, very carefully, that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew such things as that, and would thus explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Join me, Morel Benard, join me for the next video of the Invisible Man. Join me for the next video of the Invisible Man. I look forward to seeing you there. Okay, for now, Morel saying bye now.